Huge thank you to Dan and the staff and also the Military History Society of Ireland for co-organising the conference day, and a huge shout out to Jerry Shannon, who's been doing a lot of the groundwork on this, and just thank you so much everyone to see you all here today. But I'm going to talk about Cathal Brugha and his role in the Easter Rising. And I suppose to begin with, just to bring it back to his involvement in the Irish Volunteers, which he joined on its inception in 1913. Now, we've heard from Mary already about his involvement in the Keaton branch. He had been a member of the IRB, sworn in 1908. But his role as president of the Keaton branch, being the most militant branch of the Gaelic League, it sort of cements or ties in the IRB and the Gaelic League. And the membership of the Keaton branch, it's literally a who's who of revolutionaries that were to be involved in 1916 and beyond. But as I said, joined the Volunteers in 1913 when they were formed. He was appointed a second lieutenant of D Company of the 4th Battalion, and he was to be associated with the 4th Battalion for the remainder of his life. He actually took part in the Host gun running. He was in charge of a party of 20 members of the IRB whose role was to deter the police from actually making an advance, trying to interfere with the Volunteers landing the guns. And by 1915, he was appointed Vice Commandant of the 4th Battalion, Eamon Cant being appointed or elected the Commandant. And the two men, through their connection or their shared love of the Irish language, their membership of the Gaelic League, the two men were very close friends as well as comrades. Now, really, and this photograph is where I managed to find this photograph, because there aren't that many photographs of Cathal Brugha. And this is taken from the 1915 O'Donovan Rossa Funeral Committee, which of course Cathal Brugha was a member of, involved in planning the repatriation of O'Donovan Rossa, one of those massive publicity and propaganda opportunities used by the Volunteers. And although he wasn't a member of the Military Council of the IRB, he was aware or made aware of the plans of the Easter Rising. And shortly before the Rising, he was sent down to liaise with the Volunteers in Kilkenny to alert them of the manoeuvres that were going to happen on Easter Sunday, not giving them any more details, but he himself was aware of what was actually planned to happen. And he was, like so many, disheartened when the countermanding order came through. He was very much of the same opinion of Clark and many others, that the Volunteers should be used as an offensive body to strike a blow, especially when the First World War was in full swing. Opposite to McNeill's idea of it being a defensive body. But he was prepared to go on Easter Monday when the mobilisations order were sent out after the mobilisation had been cancelled on Easter Sunday. And he had met with Eamon Cant in the house of John Doherty on Dolphin's Barn, and he went home that night to spend his last night, what possibly would be the last night alive, with his heavily pregnant wife, Kathleen. So on Easter Monday morning, the orders are sent out hurriedly. You have many accounts from the Volunteers from the 4th Battalion, as the other battalions, where they received the orders at 9 o'clock that morning, 10 o'clock that morning, that to mobilise at these points all around the city. And the 4th Battalion were sent or were ordered to mobilise at Emerald Square, just off Cork Street, where they did from around 10 o'clock. Now, you have accounts from others where there was some problem with their bicycles and they arrived there late, but you have the main body of the Volunteers and the Nina branch of Cumann because 25 women of Cumann did mobilise, firstly at the Cleaver Hall branch of the Gaelic League at Denora Avenue, and then marched down to meet up with the men in Emerald Square. And there they were met by their Commandant, Eamon Cant, Vice Commandant, Cathal Brugha, and another Lieutenant of B Company, which was W.T. Cosgrave. Ideally, Cant should have had about 700 people under his command. Approximately, he had less than 120 to take control of a huge area. So at roughly 11:30, the small group, they march off. You had Con Colbert, who was tasked with taking over or occupying Watkins Brewery down on Ardee Street. And they were sent there to basically hold off or stop any military that might come from Griffith Barracks, what was Wellington Barracks at the time. You have A Company under Seamus Murphy. When the detachment move off, they come out onto Cork Street, march down Cork Street, swing a left onto Marrowbone Lane, and that's where the group then breaks up, because you have A Company under Seamus Murphy. They take another left and make their way into Jameson Distillery, or what we call Marrowbone Lane Distillery, and then the other group headed by Cathal Brugha and Cosgrave continued their march on. You have Cant leading some of the men to the rear of what was the South Dublin Union via the Rialto entrance, and then you have Brugha and others going to the South Dublin Union, making their way to the main entrance, was faced out onto James Street, right opposite the house of W.T. Cosgrave. There, the group again split off, because you have a small detachment under Thomas McCarthy who were sent to occupy Rose Distillery just down the road on Mount Brown. By Tuesday, certainly, you have both Watkins and Rose being evacuated by those two garrisons. Colbert, he made his way back to Marrowbone Lane Distillery, and then you have Thomas McCarthy, his group just dispersed. So it leaves the two garrisons, one in the South Dublin Union, where you have Cant and Brugha and Cosgrave and many others, roughly about 70 men in all, and then those under Seamus Murphy, supported by Colbert and what was to become 22 women of the Nenagh branch of Cumann. So there we have the outposts that were taken over by the 4th Battalion. But as I said, it's a massive, massive area that Cant had under his command. The South Dublin Union was a warren of streets. You have over 3,000 patients being held in the South Dublin Union. It's literally like a city within a city. So where was Cant to go? On the suggestion of W.T. Cosgrave, who was a local, who knew the area. Actually, Cant and W.T. Cosgrave had been known to members of staff in the South Dublin Union. Cant himself had actually walked around the South Dublin Union the week before. But it was suggested by Cosgrave that they should focus their attention or make their headquarters or set up their headquarters in the nurses' home, which is one of the few buildings that stands in the complex today. Now, this image, the top image, is shown the entrance to the South Dublin Union. You had a small group of volunteers that were sent to occupy the upper floors, which became known as the boardroom area. So you do have a detachment of volunteers in there. The image below is the nurses' home, and then you have a small detachment, initially about 12 men, that were sent under George Irvine to occupy the sheds, which literally were made of corrugated iron, so no protection there at all. And that was under the command of George Irvine at the back of the complex. But John Finch and Joyce, who was a member of C Company, he said, describing the occupation or the when they move off from Emerald Square, that the few police that followed up took a great interest in our movements, and when A Company under Seamus Murphy turned into Marrowbone Lane Distillery, it was apparent that there was serious business afoot. When we reached James Street, a party was detailed to take over Rose Distillery, and the remainder of the battalion, about 70 in all, marched into the Union precisely at noon. Parties were immediately detailed to hold different points in the grounds of the huge institution, and just look at how big it was. So you can see from the map here just the scale of the area that Amy Cant had to control with 70 men. It is pretty much impossible, but he did what he could. Now you have the orchard there. There was a small contingent, a small group of volunteers sent there. That's now where Mount Brown, the housing estate, is. It was known as McCaffrey's Orchard. You had the volunteers then at the rear, and then the other group centred at the front, the nurses' home. Also later on, the bakehouse and the boardroom. So the thing is, we know about the occupation of Dublin Castle, and very soon after that is occupied by the Citizen Army, the fighting takes place. Well, the fighting happened pretty much immediately. Very soon after the volunteers go into the South Dublin Union, they are involved in a fight, because the reason that you have the South Dublin Union being taken over in the first place was to stop British soldiers that would come from Richmond Barracks to make their way in to attack the GPO, the headquarters of the volunteers. So you have Kent and his men are to stop those soldiers from getting in. You also had soldiers that would be placed in the Royal Hospital. So there was access for a lot of soldiers to get in to attack the GPO. Little over half an hour after they go into the South Dublin Union, the fighting begins, because that's exactly what happens. Members of the Royal Irish Regiment come down from Richmond Barracks and they're immediately attacked and fired upon by the volunteers. Padder Doyle recounts in his witness statement, and he was quartermaster of the South Dublin Union garrison, saying that at the time the present site of Can's Fort was known as McCaffrey's Orchard, about a dozen men were stationed here under cover of the trees, and no sooner had they taken up their posts than a detachment of infantry marched from Richmond Barracks. Our men immediately opened fire and there was a number of casualties on both sides. This had a result of holding off the attack contemplated. I think it was in this affray that Volunteers Owen and Donlan were killed, and Dan McCarthy and a couple of others were wounded. But just to go back to the map, you can see that where those volunteers were, so the soldiers are coming down Mount Brown, they're completely in the open, and they would be really in danger, because very soon after you have the soldiers in the Royal Hospital, Cumanum, which is just a short distance away. They set up a machine gun post and they trained their fire on the volunteers in the orchard, so completely out in the open. Now, George Irvine, who was at the rear of the complex where he's in charge of those little corrugated sheds which offered no protection at all, he says that of the fighting that happened on Easter Monday, that 3 men from the other companies came to me later, so I had 9 men. That's all he had under his control. Commandant Kent told me to take up position in the huts inside the gate and barricade the windows. After some time, the British soldiers appeared and started to scale the wall around the South Dublin Union, and our men picked off a few of them. We found the huts mere matchboxes without any cover from fire, being made of tin wood. Later, we tried to join Commandant Kent, but in the main building, but found we were cut off in that direction, and one of the men, Paddy Morrissey, was wounded. We had to go back to the huts. We now occupy the back room of the hut we were in, but the British had closed in on us, and in the evening were pouring volleys into the hut. One man just beside me, John Traynor, got a bullet through his eye. I saw we could hold out no longer and asked the men would I surrender. They agreed, and I did so. Because when the British were initially attacked, they then fall back and they divide their detachments and they make their way into the rear of the complex, and then they come into contact with George Irvine and his men, but they are then themselves forced to surrender. So Tuesday and Wednesday, you have the focus being attached really on the front of the complex. You have some men being sent out from the nurses' home to retrieve the bodies of those volunteers who had been killed in the initial attack. Also, a number of patients and certainly one member of staff, who we'll talk about later on, had been killed. So it must have been awful for the patients that were in the South Dublin Union, who were caught in this war zone at this time, and there was no escape for them. But you can see here from the map where the main focus of the fight would be. And there you have the front of the building, the boardroom, the bakehouse, and then you have the nurses' home. Now, you can see that they're not all linked up. They're pretty much isolated, especially the nurses' home to the boardroom. But you then have volunteers being sent to the bakehouse, and somehow over those few days, they were able to connect the 3 buildings together. So the nurses' home there, you can see that there is a wide open space, which obviously was a huge gap in the defences of the volunteers, because you have the British beginning to regroup, and that was where they would focus their attack. So you would have to cover that area of open space. At this time, when you consider those who had been killed, those who had been wounded, and those who had been taken prisoner, Kent has under his command roughly 41 men. And just to say that there were no women in the South Dublin Union, although Kent did give the women of Cumann of the Nenagh branch the option to go into a number of the outposts. The women of the Nenagh branch decided to stay together, and that's how you have them all in Marrowbone Lane Distillery under Seamus Murphy. So James Coughlan, and we are so lucky with the resources we have available, certainly Bureau of Military History, the witness statements, the pension files, but also the RTE Daily Archives website. If any of you haven't seen it, look at our 1916 and 66 exhibition, because there you have testimonies, interviews that were done in 1966 with big names as well as ordinary rank and file volunteers, including James Coughlan. And he talks about what happened on Sunday, because Tuesday and Wednesday the volunteers are preparing their defences in the nurse's home and the boardroom and the bakehouse, but you have the British then beginning to organise and plan their attack, and it all changes on Thursday morning thanks to the arrival mainly of the Sherwood Foresters, who had come from England. Now the Sherwood Foresters, you have the group that, unfortunately for them, they are told to march down Mount Street Bridge or over Mount Street Bridge, and there they come under the attack of Eamon de Valera's men from Clonmilliam House and from Northumberland Road. But you have the regiment dividing, and the other regiments managed to get away freely, safely, and they do make their way or head towards the Royal Hospital, Kilmainham. Now, the way they're coming was by the South Circular Road at the back of the South Dublin Union. They're bringing much needed ammunition to the detachment that is in the Royal Hospital. So the attack, the proposed attack, they're preparing for it. But what James Coughlan says about being in the nurse's home at that stage and about his commanding officers, he says the following morning on Thursday we heard that both the Vice Commandant and Commandant himself were missing from nightfall until daybreak that morning. In consideration of the boarding party and myself, and not wishing to impose extra guard duty on the remainder of our comrades, the Commandant and Vice Commandant remained in that bakehouse the whole night, guarding this new dangerous gap in our defences. Dangerous in effect because the bakehouse doors had not yet been barricaded. They completed the breakthrough to James's Street later that day. Just as they did, the British all-out attack against us commenced. And that is really important, because you do have a lot of the men saying that both Kent and Cathal Brugha, they would not ask men to do something they were not prepared to do themselves, sometimes to the detriment of the officers, because the men felt that if anything happened to them, who was going to lead them? They were meant to give the orders and the lads would follow the orders. But here we have both Kent and Brugha actually in the thick of it and being involved in the action. So the final onslaught came on Thursday, and it is crazy to think that literally a couple of hours from now, on this day, 108 years ago, was when Cathal Brugha was severely injured in that final assault on the South Dublin Union. So here we have two of the men who were charged with leading that assault, members of the Nottingham and Derbyshire Regiment of the Sherwood Foresters, Captain Michael Martin and Captain John Sherlock Oates, whose father was actually a commanding officer, overseeing everything, ordering his son to go in and lead the attack, trying to remove the volunteers. But where were the volunteers and where was Brugha at this time? So you have Cathal Brugha being in charge of the section in the nurse's home. Now, it was a veritable fortress. You can see from these photographs, and again, thanks to the Bureau of Military History, their gallery, their image gallery, all these photographs are from there. And you can see the porch, so it's like a double porch there. So they had barricaded the inner door. So you have the outer door, the gap, and then the inner door, which was completely barricaded. Pretty high up, you'd access through the fan line. And then we have the stairs leading up. Now, Kent was elsewhere. He was over, I think, in the boardroom. He was discussing things with the volunteers there. So Brugha is left in command, and he was upstairs on the first floor landing. The British troops, they begin to encircle and get closer and closer and closer to the nurse's home until finally they manage to actually break through into the porch. They manage to break through a wall, I think, on the right-hand side and get into the porch, but they can't get any further because there's a wall pretty much in front of them. So what they then had to do, or what they decided to do, was to start throwing bombs and grenades over. Now, there was a lot of confusion. There was Cathal Brugha worrying about men that were downstairs. He does come down to see what is going on, and he gets wounded at this point. In the initial skirmish, or the initial fighting that happens in the porch, at least three British soldiers were killed. So they're caught completely off guard and they are trapped in that small space. They couldn't, as I said, pass the barricade. So the bombs, they come over again and again and again. And I will leave it to James Coughlan and John Vincent Joyce to describe what happens then. So James Coughlan says that one of these bombs they slung over seriously wounded the Vice Commandant, Cathal Brugha. He found himself immobilised. He orders the garrison in the nurse's home to evacuate and join Commandant Kent and his party in the next building. Before they left, he had himself placed on the kitchen table near the back window in the kitchen so that he could, using his Mauser automatic, contest any entry from the rear. So reluctantly, the small garrison do leave and they make their way over to Kent. And I suppose fearing that Cathal Brugha, there was no way he could survive this onslaught, Kent is informed. However, despite an amount of time passing, what they thought had happened, the inevitable, the battle was over, the British took the nurses home, the sound of gunfire was still going on. And Kent realises they haven't taken that building. There's a possibility that Brugha may still be alive, so they make their way back. John Vincent Joyce recalled in 1926, the little garrison waited patiently for what everybody expected to be the end, when suddenly we heard the explosions of bombs and the bark of a Mauser from the nurse's home. And rising above the din, sorry, I'm getting goosebumps now reading this, we heard Cathal Brugha singing God Save Ireland. The effect was electric. Led by our commandant and the other officers, we all rushed back, and very soon the nurses' home was cleared of the enemy. Cathal Brugha had saved the situation. Lying there on the kitchen floor, badly wounded, he had prevented the enemy from crossing the barricades, and his song had inspired the defenders to come back and repel the Saxon. It was typical of this brave man, who was absolutely fearless. And they did repel the attack. The British, they did withdraw. There was no further sort of large-scale assault on the South Dublin Union. And what happened after that? Well, the surrender did come. You had the order coming from Pearse, where each garrison had to surrender, and Eamon Kent, with a small group of men, the British thought there were about 200 people, a group of less than 50 people, walked out the South Dublin Union, linked up with the garrison in Marylebone Lane, and then marched down to Bride Street, where the surrender was taken, and they were then brought to Richmond Barracks to await their fate. In the battle, 8 volunteers lost their lives. Frank Burke, who was the stepbrother of W.T. Cosgrave, James Quinn, Richard O'Reilly, William McDowell, John Traynor, Brendan Donnellan, John Adams and John Owens, who was one of the first volunteers to be killed when the initial fighting took place on Monday. But also we have the casualty of Nurse Margaret Keogh, who was also killed in the early stages of the fighting on Easter Monday when she went out to help, it seems, a wounded volunteer, and she was accidentally shot. She is remembered, which is lovely to see. In 1965, there was a plaque unveiled to her in the grounds of what's now James's Hospital. Nurse Margaret Keogh of Leyland Bridge, County Carlow, who died of bullet wounds received in this hospital while performing her professional duties in a heroic manner on Easter Monday 1916. And more recently, due to the decade of centenaries, there is a ward named after her in James's Hospital. But what of Brugha? What of the leaders? Well, the leaders of the Rising, the signatories of the proclamation, were executed. However, Cathal Brugha, he was not taken to Richmond Barracks or Kilmainham Jail, although he was arrested because he had suffered 25 wounds from bullets and shrapnel from the bombs. Initially treated in the South Dublin Union, he was then brought to Dublin Castle, which was a hospital. At the time, James Connolly was taken there before his execution. But Brugha was to lose many friends in the coming weeks, including his friend and comrade and commanding officer Eamon Cant, Con Colbert, and many others. Brugha was transferred to St. Bricken's, what's now St. Bricken's Hospital, King George V Hospital, and was discharged in August. He was seen as being incurable, that his wounds were so severe. And the British, I suppose, another mistake that he made after 1916, apart from the executions and the mass arrests, they probably thought that Brugha, because he had been so severely injured, life-changing injuries, that he would just settle back in to civilian life. How wrong they were, because there were a core group of people that were tasked with reorganisation. 2 4th Battalion men, 2 men who were going to become very good friends in the coming years, and one of them, of course, being Cathal Brugha, and the other being Liam Clark, seen in this image with Con Colbert. Liam Clark, like Cathal Brugha, had been horrifically wounded during the Easter Rising. He was in the GPO and a grenade exploded in his face. I do love this photograph of Cathal Brugha getting hauled off by the police in 1917 down at Beresford Place. But these 2 men were to help both reorganise the IRB in Liam Clark's case and the Irish Volunteers in Cathal Brugha's case. And the bravery of Cathal Brugha in 1916 would fan the flames that were ignited on Easter Monday 1916 and encourage the next round or the next group of young men to continue on that fight that was started on Easter Monday 1916 and continue that fight for Irish freedom. Thank you so much.